The Red Devils versus the brash amateurs. Why Germans feared the British Beret. Picture this: World War II. Two elite forces drop from the sky behind enemy lines. One wears a maroon beret, the other a gleaming helmet. To the battle-hardened German soldiers on the ground, these two groups of paratroopers couldn't be more different. One was seen as a disciplined professional soldier, the other a brash, reckless cowboy. This is the story of why the Germans respected and even feared the British Red Devils far more than their American counterparts. To understand this, we need to step into the mindset of the Wehrmacht. The German military was built on a foundation of tradition, discipline, and a deep-seated respect for martial history. They saw themselves as the inheritors of a long, proud lineage of Prussian warriors. When they looked at the British Army, especially its elite units, they saw a reflection of themselves. The British officer class, with its Sandhurst pedigrees and stiff upper lips, represented an old-world order they understood and respected. The British soldier, known for his professionalism and stoicism, was a familiar and worthy opponent. They were predictable in a way. They fought by the book, and it was a book the Germans knew well. Then, across the Atlantic, a new kind of army was being forged. The American GI was a product of a different world entirely. A world of diners, Hollywood movies, and a can-do attitude that often bordered on arrogance in European eyes. German commanders often viewed the American army as new money, loud, flashy, and lacking the deep-rooted military traditions they held so dear. They saw an army built on industrial might and mass production, not on the centuries-old art of warfare. This perception colored everything, especially how they viewed the elite of the elite, the paratroopers. The legend of the British paratrooper was truly born in the scorched landscapes of North Africa in 1942. During intense fighting for key objectives, German soldiers witnessed the tenacity and ferocity of the British 1st Parachute Brigade. After one particularly brutal engagement, the Germans, impressed by their opponent's fighting spirit, nicknamed them the Rote Teufel or Red Devils. This wasn't just a casual moniker. It was a mark of profound respect from a battle-hardened enemy. The name stuck, and the maroon beret became a symbol of a fearsome, professional, and utterly determined foe. When German soldiers saw that beret, they knew they were facing soldiers who wouldn't break, who would hold their ground to the last man. Contrast this with their view of the American paratroopers. The young men of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were seen very differently. To the Germans, they were like reckless teenagers from the American Midwest, full of bravado and fueled by chewing gum and bravado. They were unpredictable, often improvising tactics on the fly. While this could sometimes be effective, German officers often saw it as a lack of discipline and proper training. They were perceived as cowboys, relying on overwhelming firepower and individual aggression rather than coordinated, disciplined tactics. They didn't fight by the established rules of European warfare, which, to the German military mind, was not a sign of innovation but of amateurism. A huge part of this perception came down to the differences in training. The British airborne training was notoriously rigorous and selective. It was an extension of their long-standing commando program, designed to weed out all but the most physically and mentally robust individuals. The process was long, arduous, and steeped in tradition. A British para was not just trained. He was forged. The coveted maroon beret and Pegasus patch were symbols of having survived one of the toughest military selection courses in the world. This created a soldier who was not only highly skilled, but also deeply indoctrinated into the unit's elite ethos. American airborne training, on the other hand, was a marvel of mass production, a necessity born from the need to build a massive army in a very short time. While still incredibly tough and demanding, the sheer scale was different. The US aimed to produce entire divisions of paratroopers, not just a few elite brigades. To the Germans, this looked like a factory assembly line for soldiers. They believed this mass production approach inevitably led to a dilution of quality. They felt that the American system prioritized quantity over the individual quality and deep-seated professionalism that they saw in their British counterparts. The American para was tough, no doubt, but was he a true professional soldier in the classical sense? The Germans were skeptical. This all culminated in a general verdict within the Wehrmacht, a sentiment often echoed in captured documents and post-war interviews. A German officer famously summarized the difference like this: "One is a soldier, the other is a cowboy." This simple phrase captures the essence of their perception. The British paratrooper, the Red Devil, was a professional soldier. He was disciplined, well-trained, and fought with a cold, calculated ferocity that the Germans understood and respected. He was a peer. The American paratrooper was the cowboy. He was brave, aggressive, and incredibly dangerous, but in a wild, unpredictable way. He fought with an individualistic flair that baffled the rigid, hierarchical German command structure. They saw his actions not as tactical brilliance, but as reckless abandon. While American paratroopers proved their incredible bravery and effectiveness time and time again, from Normandy to Bastogne, the German perception remained. They were fighting a new kind of enemy, one that didn't fit into their traditional view of warfare. So in the end, it was a clash of cultures as much as a clash of armies. The German military, steeped in its own traditions, saw a kindred spirit in the British professional, a worthy adversary in a game with established rules. But in the American, they saw a wild card, a brash amateur who was changing the rules of the game entirely. And while they might have feared the cowboy's unpredictable shot, they held a deeper, more profound respect for the soldier who wore the red beret. The Red Devils. Why the Germans gave them the name? Why were the German soldiers in World War II so terrified of a simple maroon beret? The answer lies with one of the most elite fighting forces of the entire war, the British Parachute Regiment. The Germans themselves gave them a chilling nickname, the Red Devils, and it wasn't a term of endearment. It was born from a mix of respect and genuine fear. So what made these airborne soldiers so formidable? Let's travel back to the gritty, sun-baked battlefields of North Africa, specifically the Battle of Tunisia in late 1942. This was where the legend of the Red Devils was forged in fire. Freshly dropped into hostile territory, often outnumbered and lightly armed, the 1st Parachute Brigade was tasked with seizing key airfields and strategic points deep behind enemy lines. The Germans expected a swift victory against what they saw as amateurish, upstart paratroopers. They were about to get a rude awakening. In one legendary action, less than 500 men from the 2nd Parachute Battalion were ordered to take an airfield at Depienne. After a grueling march, they found it abandoned, but soon found themselves surrounded by a far superior German force. Cut off and with dwindling supplies, they faced annihilation. Instead of surrendering, they fought their way out, marching and battling for days through enemy territory to rejoin Allied lines. Only about 150 men made it back. This incredible feat of endurance and raw courage sent a shockwave through the German command. These weren't just soldiers. They were something else entirely. This toughness was rooted in a core British military doctrine: stand fast. It's a mentality of stubborn, unyielding defense. When a British paratrooper dug in, he was there to stay. They would hold their ground against overwhelming odds, fighting to the last man and the last round. This wasn't about blind fanaticism. It was about professional pride and an unbreakable sense of duty to the man next to them. German reports from the time are filled with astonishment at the paratroopers' refusal to break, even when tanks were rolling over their foxholes. This sheer, bloody-minded stubbornness was terrifying to an enemy accustomed to blitzkrieg tactics, where shock and speed were meant to shatter an opponent's will to fight. With the Red Devils, their will was made of steel. And speaking of steel, let's talk about the bayonet. While other armies were increasingly reliant on firepower, the British paratroopers had a particular fondness for close-quarters combat. They were trained extensively in the use of the bayonet and the fighting knife. They believed in the psychological impact of a silent, cold steel charge. In the chaos of night battles or trench clearing, A sudden brutal bayonet assault could shatter enemy morale in a way bullets never could. The Germans, who often preferred to engage from a distance, found this preference for up-close and personal fighting deeply unsettling. It felt primal, savage, and was a terrifying prospect for any soldier holding a defensive line. The glint of a bayonet in the moonlight, accompanied by a determined British advance, became a nightmare for many Wehrmacht and SS troops. This leads us to another key trait: their cold, calculated professionalism. Paratroopers are, by nature, a special breed. They willingly jump out of airplanes into the heart of enemy territory. This requires a level of mental fortitude that few possess. The British Paras were rigorously selected and trained not just to be physically tough, but to remain calm under extreme pressure. When things went wrong and on an airborne drop, they almost always did, they didn't panic. They assessed, adapted, and fought on. This ability to maintain discipline and effectiveness, even when scattered, isolated, and surrounded, was a huge advantage. A German soldier might find himself fighting a single determined paratrooper who had missed his drop zone by miles, but was still carrying out his mission with lethal efficiency. This unpredictability, this sense that every single Red Devil was a self-reliant and deadly threat, made them incredibly dangerous. And so we come back to the symbol itself, the maroon beret. It wasn't just headwear. It was a badge of honor earned through one of the toughest training regimes in the world. For the Allied forces, it represented the elite. But for the German soldiers who faced them in Tunisia, Sicily, Normandy, and at Arnhem, that splash of maroon on the horizon meant something very different. It signaled the arrival of the Rote Teufel, the Red Devils. It meant a fight to the death was coming. It meant facing men who wouldn't break, who wouldn't run, and who might just charge their position with nothing but silence and cold steel. The fear of the maroon beret wasn't just about the soldiers wearing it. It was about the indomitable spirit and terrifying professionalism they represented. The legacy of the Red Devils is a powerful testament to how a small, elite force can have a psychological impact far greater than its numbers. They proved that courage, training, and an unshakable will to win could be the most powerful weapons on any battlefield. The American cowboy style, why Germans weren't initially impressed. So what exactly did the Germans see that made them so dismissive? One of the biggest things was the American reliance on overwhelming firepower. The US military doctrine was built around artillery. Before any major push, the sky would darken with shells, the ground would shake for hours. To the Americans, this was just smart tactics. Why risk a soldier's life when a 105mm shell can do the job? It was a strategy of industrial might, a way to grind the enemy down before the infantry even moved in. But to the battle-hardened German soldiers, especially the Fallschirmjäger who prided themselves on tactical finesse and individual skill, this looked like a crutch. They saw it as a lack of confidence in their own infantry, a sign that the American soldier couldn't win a straight fight without a massive steel umbrella over his head. It seemed less like a sophisticated military strategy and more like a brute force solution, lacking the elegance and precision they valued. They wondered, what happens when you take away their big guns? Another major factor that shaped the German opinion was the chaos of American airborne drops. When US paratroopers jumped into places like Sicily or Normandy, the drops were often wildly scattered. Paratroopers ended up miles from their intended drop zones. Units were hopelessly mixed, and command structures completely broke down in the initial hours. From the American perspective, this chaos actually had an unintended benefit. The Germans had no idea where the main attack was coming from. Small pockets of American paratroopers popped up everywhere, harassing supply lines, ambushing patrols, and creating a sense of confusion that worked to the Allies' advantage. The Dirty Dozen style of small, independent groups wreaking havoc became an accidental strength. But from the German command's point of view, this disorganization looked like sheer incompetence. Their own airborne operations, like the invasion of Crete, were planned with meticulous, almost surgical precision. To them, the American landings were a complete mess, a sign of poor planning and inadequate pilot training. They didn't see tactical flexibility. They saw a logistical failure. It confirmed their bias that these Americans were just not on the same professional level as them. This perception of incompetence was reinforced by what German officers saw as a shocking lack of discipline among American troops. German military culture was built on rigid discipline, a strict hierarchy, and unquestioning obedience. The Prussian military tradition was baked into their DNA. In contrast, American soldiers were famously informal. They called their officers by their first names sometimes. They questioned orders they didn't understand, and they had a relaxed, almost casual demeanor, even in combat zones. To a German officer, this was heresy. It looked like a complete breakdown of military order. They saw soldiers who weren't afraid to talk back, who customized their uniforms, and who seemed to operate with a level of individuality that was completely alien to the German way of war. They mistook this typically American individualism for insubordination. They couldn't understand how an army like this could function effectively. They concluded that if the soldiers were this undisciplined, their officers must be weak and their training must be poor. And then there was the American bravado. The all-American paratrooper cultivated an image of being the toughest, cockiest soldier on the battlefield. They were loud, they were confident, and they walked with a swagger that seemed to broadcast their self-belief. This was part of the unit's esprit de corps, a psychological tool to build morale and a fighting spirit. They were the new kids on the block, and they wanted everyone to know they were here to win. But to the Germans who had been fighting for years across Europe and North Africa, this just looked like arrogance. They saw young, inexperienced soldiers acting like they had already won the war. It wasn't seen as the confidence of a skilled warrior, but the empty boasting of a brash amateur. The Fallschirmjäger, who saw themselves as quiet professionals, looked at this display and shook their heads. They believed that true soldiers let their actions, not their mouths, do the talking. The American swagger just reinforced their belief that these paratroopers were all style and no substance. All of these early impressions, the reliance on artillery, the chaotic drops, the perceived lack of discipline, and the sheer bravado all came to a head during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. This was the first major combat, jump for the American 82nd Airborne Division, and the first time they would face off against elite German units, including elements of the Hermann Göring Panzer Division. The drop was a disaster. High winds and inexperienced pilots scattered the paratroopers all over the southeastern corner of the island. Some planes even dropped their troops over the ocean. Units were shattered. For days, small groups of isolated Americans fought desperately against organized German and Italian forces. The Germans observing the aftermath saw their initial judgments confirmed. They saw American equipment abandoned, saw paratroopers captured who were disoriented and separated from their units, and witnessed the complete breakdown of the American operational plan. To them, the Sicily landings were proof positive that the American Airborne was a failed experiment. They saw the American paratrooper not as an elite soldier, but as a poorly trained, poorly led, and overly confident amateur who was no match for the professional German army. But history, of course, tells a different story. The Germans' initial underestimation of the American paratrooper would prove to be a fatal mistake. In the hedgerows of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and across the Rhine, these brash amateurs would prove them wrong, time and time again. The very qualities the Germans saw as weaknesses, the individualism, the flexibility born from chaos, and the unrelenting confidence would become the Americans' greatest strengths. The Cowboys learned fast. They adapted, they innovated, and they fought with a tenacity that shocked the German high command. The scattered drops in Normandy, for example, paralyzed the German response, as they couldn't figure out where the main American force was. The individual initiative of American NCOs and junior officers allowed small, cut-off units to continue fighting effectively without direct orders. And that all-American bravado? It turned into an unbreakable will to win, a refusal to be beaten that saw them through the darkest hours of battles like Bastogne. The Germans had mistaken informality for weakness and flexibility for incompetence. They paid a heavy price for that mistake. They learned the hard way that the American paratrooper wasn't just a brash amateur. He was one of the most formidable soldiers on the World War II battlefield. So the next time you see footage of those confident young men of the 82nd or 101st Airborne, remember the German perspective. Remember that they weren't initially seen as the legends they would become. They were dismissed, underestimated, and laughed at by their enemy. And the story of how they proved every single one of those doubters wrong is one of the most incredible tales of the entire war. They showed that sometimes, the things your enemy perceives as your greatest weaknesses are actually your most powerful strengths. Tactical differences, precision versus aggression. Let's break down the fundamental difference in approach. German military doctrine was all about precision, planning, and meticulous execution, a symphony of combined arms. When they looked across the battlefield, they saw two very different airborne philosophies. On one hand, you had the British Airborne divisions, like the famous 6th. Their operations were like a surgeon's scalpel, precise, targeted, and designed for maximum impact with minimal focused force. They were trained to be a self-reliant, elite force capable of executing complex plans with ruthless efficiency. On the other hand, you had the American Airborne divisions, the 101st and 82nd. If the British were a scalpel, the Americans were a sledgehammer. Their doctrine was built around overwhelming mass and aggressive initiative. The plan was often just the starting point. The real strategy was to drop thousands of men into an area, accept that chaos would ensue, and rely on the individual soldier's grit, aggression, and ability to improvise to win the day. They didn't just embrace the chaos of a combat drop, they weaponized it. To understand why the Germans respected the British approach, we have to look at one of the most audacious operations of D-Day, the capture of Pegasus Bridge. Hours before the main landings, a tiny force of just over 180 men from the British 6th Airborne, packed into 6 gliders, had a critical mission: seize 2 bridges over the Caen Canal and Orne River and hold them until relieved. This wasn't a sprawling, chaotic drop. It was a pinpoint landing. The lead glider, piloted with breathtaking skill, landed less than 50 yards from the bridge. The men stormed out, and in a swift, brutal action that lasted less than 10 minutes, they had captured Pegasus Bridge intact. Think about that from the German perspective. One moment, the night is quiet. The next, a silent glider has landed on your doorstep, and a highly trained, disciplined force has neutralized your defenses and seized a vital strategic asset before you can even radio for help. There was no massive parachute drop to alert them, no widespread chaos. Just sudden, shocking, and clinically efficient violence. This was a nightmare for a command structure that prided itself on order and control. It was unpredictable in its precision. The British demonstrated they could place a dagger exactly where it would hurt the most, without warning. Now let's contrast this with the American experience in Normandy. The drops for the 101st and 82nd Airborne were a textbook example of chaos theory in action. Bad weather, intense anti-aircraft fire, and pilot inexperience scattered the paratroopers all over the Cotentin Peninsula. Units were hopelessly mixed up. Men from the 101st found themselves fighting alongside men from the 82nd, miles from their intended drop zones. Plans went out the window almost immediately. But here's the thing, it worked. Small, ad hoc groups of American paratroopers, led by determined NCOs and junior officers, began attacking anything that looked like a target. They ambushed German patrols, cut communication lines, and seized crucial causeways and crossroads. From the German point of view, the American Airborne wasn't a cohesive force. It was a plague of hornets. They were everywhere, causing confusion and panic far behind the front lines. The German commanders couldn't get a clear picture of the situation because there was no single front. The threat was diffuse, unpredictable, and relentlessly aggressive. While effective, this victory through chaos was a style of warfare the Germans struggled to comprehend, let alone respect from a doctrinal standpoint. It seemed amateurish, a plan that relied on luck and brute force rather than skill. This brings us to the ultimate test of the British airborne spirit: Operation Market Garden and the Battle for Arnhem. This was the bridge too far, a bold, perhaps overambitious plan to use airborne forces to seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands, creating a corridor for an armored thrust into Germany. The British 1st Airborne Division was dropped at the farthest and most dangerous point, Arnhem. From the start, everything went wrong. Their radios failed. The drop zones were too far from the bridge, and they landed right on top of 2 recuperating SS Panzer divisions, a catastrophic intelligence failure. What followed was not a story of swift victory, but one of legendary stubbornness. A single battalion, Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Battalion, managed to fight its way to the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge. There, this small force, numbering only about 700 men, held out for 4 days against overwhelming German armor and infantry. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned, with no hope of reinforcement. Yet they refused to break. They fought from houses, basements, and ruins, exacting a terrible toll on the elite German forces trying to dislodge them. From the German perspective, this was both infuriating and awe-inspiring. They expected the lightly armed paratroopers to be swept aside. Instead, they encountered a force that fought with a discipline and tenacity that bordered on suicidal. The Germans, who understood the grim calculus of holding a position against impossible odds, saw in the men at Arnhem a reflection of their own military ideals. Even in defeat, the British paratroopers at Arnhem cemented their reputation. They hadn't won the bridge, but they had demonstrated a level of professional soldiering and unbreakable courage that any military man, German or otherwise, had to respect. They were professionals, doing their job to the bitter end. So why did the German military mind, so focused on order and structure, fear the British style more? It comes down to predictability, or rather, the lack of it in a way they understood. The American approach, while terrifying in its ferocity, was a known type of chaos. It was a blunt instrument. You could counter it with containment, with setting up kill zones, and by weathering the initial storm. You knew they would be aggressive and attack from all directions. The British approach was different. It was the fear of the calculated professional opponent. When the British airborne landed, a German commander knew he was facing a force that had a specific, well-rehearsed plan. They weren't just a mob of angry soldiers. They were a specialized tool being applied to a specific problem. The fear wasn't of random attacks, but of a single, precise, and potentially war-winning move, like the one at Pegasus Bridge. It was the fear that your most critical, and supposedly secure, asset was about to be taken from you by a small group of experts. It was a chess move, not a bar fight. This resonated with the German military psyche, which appreciated operational art and skill. They saw the British paratroopers not as brash amateurs, but as fellow professionals, and a highly dangerous, unpredictable kind at that. This created a unique psychological edge. The fear of the unknown is potent, but the fear of a known expert is arguably greater. German soldiers facing the Americans knew they were in for a brutal, chaotic fight. But when they heard the Red Devils were in the area, they knew they were facing an enemy who had likely planned their demise in painstaking detail. It was the difference between fearing a wild bear and fearing a master assassin. Both are deadly, but the assassin implies a level of intelligence, planning, and precision that is psychologically more unnerving. In the end, both the British and American airborne forces were instrumental to Allied victory, and their soldiers were all heroes of incredible bravery. But their methods were born of different national characters and military philosophies. The Americans won through improvisation, individual aggression, and a willingness to embrace chaos. The British won through meticulous planning, surgical precision, and a stubborn professionalism that held firm even in the face of certain defeat. And for the German officers who faced them, it was the cold, calculated professionalism of the men in the maroon beret, the Red Devils, that often inspired the most profound and telling respect. The changing tide. When the Germans realized their mistake. In the early days of airborne warfare, the British 1st Airborne Division, with their distinctive maroon berets, quickly established a fearsome reputation. From North Africa to Sicily and Italy, they were battle-hardened veterans. When they dropped into combat, they were known for their discipline, their aggressive tactics, and their sheer tenacity. German soldiers who faced them wrote about their professionalism and their relentless fighting spirit. They saw the Brits as a seasoned elite force that you did not want to encounter. The Rote Teufel, or Red Devils, was a name born out of respect and, frankly, a healthy dose of fear. These weren't just soldiers. They were seen as the best of the best, a true spearhead force. Then came the Americans. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were, by comparison, the new kids on the block. When they dropped into Normandy on D-Day, many of their troopers were seeing their first real combat. The landings were chaotic. Units were scattered all over the French countryside, far from their intended drop zones. Instead of fighting as cohesive divisions, they were forced to operate in small, ad hoc groups. To the Germans, who valued order and structure, this looked like amateur hour. They saw the Americans not as a disciplined army, but as a disorganized mob of individual fighters. They were aggressive, yes, but they seemed to lack the professional polish of their British counterparts. German reports from Normandy often described them as brash or reckless, but not necessarily as an elite, coordinated threat. The tide began to turn during Operation Market Garden. Here, both British and American paratroopers fought side by side, and the differences in their combat experience were on full display. The British 1st Airborne at Arnhem fought one of the most heroic and tragic battles of the war. They were dropped too far from their objective, faced overwhelming German armor, and were ultimately destroyed as a fighting force. But their courage under fire was legendary. They held out for 9 days against impossible odds, cementing their Red Devil reputation in the minds of the Germans who fought them. They were professionals to the very end. Meanwhile, the American 82nd and 101st Airborne had their own tough fights along Hell's Highway. They were successful in capturing their objectives, like the bridges at Nijmegen and Eindhoven. They fought hard and they fought well. But from the German perspective, they were still seen as benefiting from massive Allied air support and ground reinforcements. They weren't isolated and fighting for their lives in the same way the British were at Arnhem. So while they earned a grudging respect for their toughness, they still hadn't shaken that initial impression of being less seasoned, less disciplined fighters compared to the Brits. The Germans saw their success as a product of overwhelming American industrial might, not necessarily superior skill. The real turning point for the American paratroopers, the moment they truly came of age in the eyes of the German army, was the Battle of the Bulge. In the dead of winter 1944, Hitler launched his last-ditch offensive through the Ardennes forest, catching the Allies completely by surprise. The 101st Airborne Division was rushed to the crucial crossroads town of Bastogne. They were surrounded, undersupplied, short on winter clothing, and facing elite German panzer divisions. This was their Arnhem. But this time, the story had a different ending. When the German commander demanded their surrender, the American commander, General McAuliffe, gave his now famous one-word reply: "Nuts." It was a moment of pure American defiance that captured the spirit of the 101st. They weren't just brash anymore. They were battle-hardened. For weeks they held Bastogne against constant attacks, in freezing conditions, until Patton's Third Army could break through and relieve them. Their stubborn defense was absolutely critical to stopping the German offensive. The Screaming Eagles, as the 101st were known, had finally earned their stripes. German soldiers who fought at Bastogne realized these weren't amateurs. These were tough, resilient soldiers who could hold their ground against the best the Wehrmacht could throw at them. So why, even after Bastogne, Did the Germans never give the Americans a nickname like the Red Devils? We can find some clues by looking at post-war memoirs and interviews with German veterans. When they spoke of the British paratroopers, they often used words like professional, disciplined, and correct. They described fighting them as a deadly chess match against a skilled opponent. There was a sense of mutual professional respect. They feared the Red Devils because they knew exactly what they were capable of as a cohesive, experienced unit. When Germans talked about the Americans, the language was different. They used words like aggressive, unpredictable, and individualistic. They respected their courage and their fighting spirit, especially after the Battle of the Bulge. But they often saw them as less predictable, more like a swarm of angry hornets than a disciplined military unit. The American paratrooper was seen as a formidable individual fighter, but the German military mind, which prized collective discipline, never quite saw the American divisions with the same awe they reserved for the British 1st Airborne. The chaos of the Normandy landings had left a lasting impression. In the end, the Red Devil nickname remains a unique badge of honor for the British Parachute Regiment. It wasn't just about being tough. It was about being perceived as the complete package, skilled, disciplined, experienced, and utterly relentless. It was a reputation forged in the fire of North Africa and Sicily, and forever sealed in the tragedy and heroism of Arnhem. The British had been in the airborne game longer, and it showed. They set the standard for what an elite paratrooper unit should be. The American paratroopers, the Screaming Eagles, and the All-Americans had a different journey. They started as the brash amateurs in the eyes of their enemy, learning their trade in the chaotic fields of Normandy. But they grew up fast. They adapted, they learned, and in the frozen hell of Bastogne, they proved they were second to none. They earned their own legendary status not through a fearsome nickname from their enemy, but through sheer grit and a stubborn refusal to break. So the story of the paratroopers isn't about who was better. It's a story about two different paths to greatness. One was built on experience and professionalism, earning a title of respect and fear. The other was built on raw courage and adaptability, forged in the crucible of battle. Both the British Red Devils and the American Screaming Eagles were heroes who jumped from the sky to change the course of the war. They just earned their enemies' respect in very different ways. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this piece of military history interesting, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this. Let me know in the comments what you think. Why do you believe the Germans saw these two elite forces so differently? See you in the next video.